Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Jessica Coleman's hands never shook when she logged ammunition at Fort Ironwood. The desert air slipped through the cinderblock gaps of the range office and the hum of fluorescent lights made everything feel routine, which was exactly how she liked it. She arrived at 0630 with black coffee in a dented thermos and a uniform so faded it folded into the gray of the walls. Serial numbers, quantities, lot codes, she wrote them in the same tidy block letters that gave supervisors nothing to question. If anyone watched closely, they might have noticed how she moved with economical purpose, how she checked breech faces and gas rings without thinking, how her eyes tracked wind cutting across Range 4's open lanes like she was solving a problem no one else could see. But people didn't watch closely. People saw what they expected to see, a quiet clerk who was reliable, invisible, and always on time. Ruiz came in at 0715, boots thumping like he wanted the building to remember him. Morning call, Cole. Brass on Range 3. You set the long line. She kept her voice flat. 1 through 4 are standard quals. 5 is long distance. Target stenciled and stapled. Logs ready. He scratched at the Velcro on his sleeve, gave the clipboard a look that said he wasn't reading it, and grinned anyway. Cooper showed up 10 minutes later balancing 2 coffees and a stack of forms, hair too neat for a day on the range. He whispered something about Colonel Holbrook's schedule and nearly tripped over a crate before Riley, still all elbows and enthusiasm, caught the papers and apologized twice for existing. Jessica nodded them into the day's rhythm. Brass buckets at the corners. Ear Pro spares in the bin. Ammo checkout by signature, not memory. Outside, the Nevada morning brightened to a sharp white, heat already building on the concrete. She kept her gaze moving, counting shooters, counting magazines, counting footsteps to the firing line. The habit wasn't new. It belonged to places that didn't exist on maps and to nights when distances were measured in breaths. She had learned to disguise it here as professionalism. By 10:30 the officers rotated in for their monthly proficiency. Most were competent and distracted, talking weekend plans, hitting center mass like they were keeping their careers safely boring. Then Holbrook walked the line. He didn't demand space, it arrived anyway, the way it does for people who've seen consequences. Hair steel gray at the temples, eyes that missed nothing, voice low and clean. Ammunition for the course, he said, and when their fingers brushed as she passed the magazines, there was a flicker of recognition she couldn't place, like a coded phrase half remembered. He shot like someone who'd needed accuracy to mean survival. Tight groupings, measured breathing, no wasted motion. She logged his ammo return without looking up, then did look up, and found him watching her hands as she wrote. She'd worked calluses down over the last 3 years. You could still feel them if you knew what to feel for. Ruiz wandered back with a smirk. Ever fire one of these for real, Cole? Not counting basic. She gave him the smile she'd practiced until it fit perfectly. I'm better with paperwork, Sergeant. He laughed, satisfied with the world as he understood it. The day kept its schedule. Targets swapped. Brass swept. Signatures stacked. Calm was a thin layer you maintained with attention to detail. Jessica carried that layer like armor. A gust snuck along the bays and rattled target frames, dust lifted in sheets across Range 5, and for a second the sound of it reaching the berm folded into something else in her head, rotor wash, a radio click, a breath on the 3rd count. She clicked her pen twice and the office returned. Cooper poked his head in again. Colonel's doing a second run. He said your logs are, textbook. Riley added, hopeful, he's different, right? Jessica shrugged. Different meant eyes that added and subtracted before they spoke. Different meant not safe to underestimate. She finished the inventory and took the short walk toward the firing benches to collect a left-behind badge from a captain who always forgot things. The badge wasn't there. Another one was. Her own, face up, edge tucked under a spent casing. She reached for it as footsteps approached. Holbrook's shadow cut the light. "Forget something?" he asked, easy tone, eyes not easy at all. She held the plastic up, casual. "Can't leave the base without it." He didn't take a step closer, just lifted his hand. "May I?" It was phrased like courtesy, weighted like an order. She let it go. The wind paused. For a heartbeat the entire range seemed to hold its breath with her. He scanned the surface the way he had scanned his sight picture, not for the obvious, for the thing that could not be there. If the moment had ended differently, the day would have stayed an ordinary Tuesday in the desert. Instead, something unreadable tightened around his eyes as he reached the corner of the laminate where a classification marker shouldn't have existed on a range clerk's ID. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Jessica felt the floor of the life she'd built tilt by degrees that only instruments would register. She took back the badge when he offered it, the exchange as small as a coin, as loud as an alarm. "Miss Coleman," he said finally, soft and precise, like the first words of a briefing, "we should talk." Behind them, Ruiz called the line hot. Riley shouted, "Ready," in a voice that still believed in simple stories. Somewhere beyond the concrete and dust, the mountains toward Colorado threw long blue lines against the sky, and Jessica knew, the way you know a change in wind before you feel it, that quiet had just become temporary. And Jessica felt it in the way Holbrook's gaze narrowed while the line went hot and brass tinked against concrete like a clock counting down. He didn't make a scene. He only said, "My office, 20 minutes, with that steady cadence that made even stubborn sergeants step aside. She slipped the badge into her pocket, nodded once, and returned to the range office to lock the logbook she'd already memorized. Ruiz poked his head in, grinned cocky as ever. "Colonel got you doing special paperwork now?" She gave him the harmless smile. "Something like that." Cooper hovered behind him with a stack of forms and a face that looked like worry had borrowed it. Riley asked if he could borrow extra ear pro for a friend and she handed him a pair, noticing how his optimism had weight she didn't want to drop. The walk to Holbrook's office cut across the parade ground where the Nevada sun had turned morning into glare, and in that heat the memory of colder places drafted behind her like a shadow. The door clicked shut, blinds half drawn, dust motes turning in light like snow that couldn't decide to fall. Holbrook didn't sit, he poured coffee they both didn't need. "Miss Coleman," he said quietly, "you and I both know that ID doesn't match the job title on your door." She set the cup down untouched. "Sir, there are reasons I'm here and not elsewhere." He studied her, respectful, but relentless. "I'm not your enemy. But we may not have the luxury to circle this. Division just called. Alpine Ridge, 40 miles into the Rockies, training facility, radio cut mid-drill. They've got hostages, unknown number of hostiles, good equipment, good positions. Assaulting uphill will get people killed." The room seemed to contract to a map she could see without seeing. Snow, stone, choke points, crosswinds. She didn't ask why he was telling a clerk. He'd already told her, just not with words. "What are you asking?" "Additional duties," he said, dry like the desert outside. "Temporary. You set conditions, I back you. Or I pretend I never saw that badge and we both hope the hill forgives inexperience." A silence with edges passed between them. She'd sworn off this. She'd moved muscle memory into storage and taught herself to find relief in ink and staples. But the shape of the problem was the shape she fit. "If I go," she said, "we clear the record after. I'm not coming back to a life I didn't choose." "Understood," he said, and for the first time his voice wasn't a colonel's, it was a man's promise he intended to keep. The phone on his desk rattled and he snatched it up, listened, frowned. Copy. He hung up and looked at her like the choice had a timer. Overwatch window is best before sundown. We have a hello in 45. Lieutenant Blake will integrate you with the tactical net. Ruiz and the others don't need to know. At Blake's name, something in her shoulders eased a fraction. He was one of the rare ones who didn't measure worth by noise. Gear? She asked. He pointed to a secure locker in the corner. Signed out for maintenance, just in case. I like contingencies. The locker gave back a life she'd sealed away, hard case, numbered parts that fit her hands like they'd been waiting. She checked torque, glass, zero data, wind charts that lived in the bones of her fingers. She slid into clothing that didn't flash rank, only function, and when she looked up, Holbrook was watching without spectacle. You good? I'm precise, she said, which was the only answer that ever mattered. They moved fast after that. The corridor to the flight line tasted like dust and fuel, and Riley, sweet kid, spotted her from across the tarmac and waved like it was just training day business. She lifted a hand back, a small blessing to keep him inside the simpler world 1 hour longer. Blake met them at the Bird, tablet under his arm, jaw set in that calm way that said he'd rather do it right than do it loud. We'll insert on the leeward side, he said, tapping a topo overlay. Best sight lines are on the west ridge. Winds quartering, gusts to 8. We'll keep chatter clean. Colonel's command. Major Grant's already pinging for updates. The name introduced a colder kind of weather, Grant-like solutions that started with pressure and ended with statistics. Grant doesn't run my trigger, Jessica said. Blake's mouth twitched. No argument here. Rotors clawed the sky and Nevada dropped away into lines and color, then softened into the cold, heavy blue of Colorado backbones. The headset crackled with measured voices and she built the range in her head from the feed, buildings in a horseshoe around a training field, a single switchback road, Overwatch towers converted to nests that would punish impatience. She mapped ingress, egress, 90-second windows, the math of mercy. Over the mountains the light thinned to that honest hour where every choice is visible. Coleman, Holbrook said in her ear, more steady than the earth under them. Say the word if this turns wrong. We adapt. She looked out at the ridges lifting like a row of decisions and thought of the range office, the hum, the coffee, the careful, ordinary hours she'd taught herself to survive. Temporary, she had called the quiet. And now it was the pause before the shot, counting down. She let the numbers settle into breath and bone as the helicopter banked north and the Rockies rose like a line of hard facts that didn't care about anyone's preferences. They set down behind the leeward ridge where the wind came gentler and the snow lay crusted over scrub, and the rotors washed away into a hush that felt too clean for what they were about to do. Blake handed her a final overlay and pointed toward a shoulder of rock that would give her a lane into the training field without exposing her silhouette against the sky. 2 hours of light, he said, voice low in the headset. Wind steady from the west at 6, gusts to 9. If it swings, I'll call it. She checked the rifle one more time, more ritual than doubt, bolt slick, glass bright, turrets true to the dope she still carried like a second spine. Holbrook's channel stayed open but quiet, the kind of leadership that didn't inhale your oxygen. They moved out in a file that barely disturbed the crust, Jessica lagging a step to let Blake break trail where the snow grabbed at ankles. The climb wasn't long, but it was angled and honest, and by the time they reached the lip of the ridge she could feel the old cadence take over, the one that measured time and heartbeats between footfalls, the one that sorted sound, fabric, metal, wind, into columns marked harmless and not. She lay prone behind a boulder the size of a truck's hood and built her position from the ground up, pack under the stock toe, bipod bitten into a dish she carved with a knife tip, rear elbow tucked, sling tension so the only tremor left belonged to the planet. Through glass, Alpine Ridge came into focus like a problem statement. The compound bent around a parade field flattened by boot heels and winter, 3 buildings faced in a U, a comms mast punched at the sky, and the switchback road crawled up from the south like it regretted the whole idea. Figures moved with purpose, not panic, 8, maybe 10, armed right and layered like they knew the weather. 2 on the southwest tower, 1 pacing the catwalk with a rifle that didn't belong to amateurs. She ran the ranges, 612 to the center door, 586 to the near tower, 643 to the pacing man when he hit his most exposed mark. Wind held steady at a right to left push she could read in the small motions, the lazy shiver of a windsock, snow smoke feathering off the corner of a shed. Overwatch set, she breathed, each word spaced so the mic caught meaning and not air. Eyes on 8+. Hostages likely in the central hall, second window bank east side shows movement not matching guard pattern. Blake's reply came clean. Copy. Tactical holds at phase line blue. Your green lights their move. Holbrook added nothing but presence, which did more than any speech could have. A door opened on the far side and a man stepped into the open with a tablet and the posture of someone who thought he owned the next 15 minutes. Leadership wore a look you didn't mistake even at 600 meters. She marked him mentally, priority 1, and let him live long enough to give her the rest of his pattern. The first obstacle wasn't technical, it was ethical weight. Every time she returned to this, she had to pick it up again and feel its edges, confirm it hadn't changed shape while she was busy pretending to be a clerk. She exhaled and let the decision be what it had always been, protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves by being unforgiving with the ones who would hurt them. Win 6, full value, Blake called softly, as if reading her mind and the air together. Mirage confirms, she said, small smile no one could see. She dialed .3 mils right, held the chest just off center to catch the push, and waited for the rhythm that made the trigger break feel like an inevitability rather than a choice. Then the radio hissed with a new voice, clipped, precise, already impatient. Command, this is Major Grant. Status on neutralization. We're burning daylight. Holbrook cut in so fast it was almost gentle. Stand by, Major. Overwatch is assembling the picture. Grant's silence carried teeth. Jessica ignored it and watched the pacing guard on the catwalk pause to speak into a shoulder mic. His head angle gave her the line to a second man tucked against the tower's inner rail, almost invisible in a dead angle. She noted him, shifted back to priority 1, and felt the shot present itself like a door swinging open on well-oiled hinges. Send, Blake murmured, meaning do what you do. The rifle answered with a punch that absorbed into earth and muscle, and the .338 made the trip like a fact that refused debate. Center mass, immediate collapse, tablet skittering into snow. Conversations changed shape all at once, bodies ducked, a hand pointed the wrong way, exposing a forearm, and she took that too, not for the arm but for the rifle it was lifting toward a window where she'd glimpsed a shadow too small to be a fighter. 1 down, second neutralized, she said, calm riding the words like ballast. Assault, shift to ingress posture. Tower catwalk 2 is blind on the south quarter. Blake relayed, and the net came alive in that disciplined way that meant this wasn't their first bad afternoon. Then the compound did something she expected and hated, they dragged hostages. A man with a scarf over his face shoved 2 trainees into the open as if daring the world to shoot. Another guard took an angle that would make any shot at him risk the kids. She let her breath settle low and counted. If 3 steps, then 4, then hesitation on 5, yes, he hit the same stall pattern a second time, and she redistributed her plan like she was moving weight in a pack. Priorities shifted, the new priority 1 became the man steering the human shield game. Command, they're shifting to deterrence by exposure. I can break the shepherd, expect flinch and collapse of the tactic. Holbrook, your call. Grant, hot, take the shot. She erased Grant from her head and went to work. The shepherd's shoulder was the key. If she broke the deltoid where it met the scapula she dropped the rifle out of the fight without pushing the muzzle across the hostages. Wind ticked up, she corrected a tenth, let the crosshair sit in air rather than on cloth, and pressed through the last ounce. The man spun as if yanked by a wire, weapon clattering away, and the second guard flinched wide to cover, overexposing ribs. She took the ribs like signing a form. Shepherd disabled, Cover man down, she reported, voice still level. Assault, go. Blake's moving came as she was already searching for the next problem, which snapped into view at the comms mast, a third element touching off a flare, a signal to someone not on the map. She adjusted elevation for the mast's base, then shifted to the man's hip to anchor him without detonation risk if he'd rigged something worse. The round took him off his feet and he folded without hand closure. The flare fell harmlessly into a snowbank. Below, a stack flowed to the center door, split, flowed again like water had learned doctrine. She pushed her awareness wider, looking for the thing that ruins neat plans, the late pair, the garage door, the truck that shouldn't be in neutral, and found it on the switchback, a pickup angled nose out with two men who weren't watching the fight, they were watching the road, which meant exit strategy or outside support. Range 711, wind still ticking right. She took tires first to force stillness, then a radiator to kill momentum, then the driver when his hands scrambled for a long gun. The passenger threw up both palms like the mountain owed him mercy. He got it, because she wasn't here to collect statistics. Vehicle disabled. One surrendering. The net answered with acknowledgments and a surge of motion she didn't need to manage. For a span of 60 seconds that felt like a clean hallway, everything aligned. Then a window in the central hall blew out and a muzzle pushed into daylight at a height that matched where a terrified head would be behind it. She didn't think, she executed the thing that training turns into instinct, offset the hold by the width of a human head, aim for the shadow of the wrist, break the wrist, let the muzzle fall. The shot cracked, glass spat, the weapon nosedived, a scream cut short. Weapon out. Hostage intact. She could feel her pulse without hearing it, steady as a metronome in a quiet room. Blake's voice rode that calm. Assault has entry. Hall secure in 30. Snow began to sting the air in small, wind-pushed flecks, the light leaning toward evening. Jessica lifted her head from the scope long enough to feel the cold on her face, then went back to glass because relief was for later and only if the count matched. In the far corner of the yard a figure crawled under a utility stair, thinking angles had made him invisible. She put a round through the step above his head, he froze, hands spread. Last hostile giving up near utilities, she said, and the word last carried a question she would verify herself before anyone else believed it. Silence returned in pieces, like a building giving back rooms one by one. On the net, Holbrook's voice came in with the softness of closure and the steel of command. Overwatch, status. She breathed, counted, scanned, and finally let the exhale carry something close to an answer. Compound controlled. Hostages accounted. Perimeter stable. Recommend secure and hold for intel exploit. Grant came back with a tone that tried to own the victory. Copy, move to exploitation. Holbrook ignored him and spoke to her instead. Jessica, stay on glass until the last team clears. Then we talk. She kept watching while snow decided to become real, while the mountains pulled the sun down toward a line that would end the light, while the trainees were walked out with blankets and eyes that were older than this morning. She had called the quiet temporary. Now it returned like a grace that knew its job, fragile and necessary, and she guarded it with the barrel pointed at nothing at all when the net twitched with a kind of silence that wasn't quiet, one of those collective pauses where trained people all hear the same wrong note at once. Snow hissed a little harder across the ridge, evening bending the light into that dull pewter that flattens depth, and Jessica rolled a half degree to widen her field just as a new sound came thin up the valley, not wind, not birds, a distant two-stroke growl riding the switchbacks like trouble choosing its speed. Overwatch. Blake's voice was calm, already moving. She glassed low, past the dead pickup, and picked the movement out of gray on gray, a snow machine hugging the inside line, a second behind it, both stacked with dark shapes that didn't read as rescue. 2 sleds inbound from the south spur, 3 riders total, rifles slung. 1 case on the rear rack looks like commo or demo, she reported, measuring their ETA against the last clean minute of daylight. On the yard below, the assault team had the hostages in the central hall under blankets, counting heads against a list they hadn't had time to write. If the sleds made the open, they'd have angles on that glass. Grant wants them interdicted at the bend, someone said over the net, hot with eagerness. Holbrook cut it off. Overwatch decides. She has the picture. She tracked the front sled and tasted the wind shifting a quarter value left, subtle as a changed mind. Full stop on the easy shot at the bend. If she broke the driver there, the machine could skid into the fence and send metal through glass like shrapnel. Negative on the bend. I'll take them before the culvert, she said, dialing a tenth and holding low to catch the machine's bounce. The front rider leaned into the turn, a profile flash under a balaclava, and for an instant the scars of other nights lined up with this one, the same math of momentum, the same lie that waits at the edge of haste. She shot where the engine would be when physics arrived, and the sled bucked into a white spray, the driver ripping free and tumbling as the second rider tried to arrest the machine with a boot and failed. He came up with a rifle and made the mistake of checking his 6. She took the decision out of his hands. Lead sled neutralized. Second sled still moving, she said, already swinging to the tail machine. That driver had learned the right lesson fast. He dumped the cargo case and punched throttle, the passenger twisting to fire wild at the buildings, muzzle high, fear making him tall. The round sparked uselessly against a shed. She punctured the track housing, then clipped the passenger's weapon, then, when he reached for the case on instinct, anchored his wrist to the world with a shot that would give him a future he wouldn't enjoy but would survive. The machine slewed sideways and died like a bad plan. Both sleds stopped. One wounded, one down, one compliant, she called. A breath she hadn't meant to hold let itself go, but the relief didn't find a home. The compound shifted in the same heartbeat, as if some timer in the kidnappers' heads had just hit 0. The door of the central hall flew wide and a man in a gray parka shoved a trainee ahead of him with the barrel of an SMG lodged at the kid's spine, dragging the human geometry into the open. Another figure appeared on the hall's far side, smaller, mask crooked, hands shaking but purpose hard. She had a deadman switch couched in her palm and wires ghosting back under her sleeve. "We've got a vest," Blake said evenly, already closing space he couldn't see. Jessica didn't answer. Her world narrowed to 2 points and a thin line of sky between them. The SMG man yanked the trainee toward the steps and screamed a demand the mic didn't catch. The woman with the switch took 3 sliding steps toward the window as if she meant to show the glass a lesson. If the boy tripped or the woman clenched, this ended wrong twice. Wind came colder, a left tick that threatened to turn into a shove. She exhaled into a hold that wasn't about time, it was about removing time. "Holbrook," she said, voice low and plain, "I'm taking the switch," then the gun. He didn't fill the air with trust, he left the air empty so her skill could fit. Send. She came off magnification a quarter turn to widen her awareness, took the woman's wrist at a diagonal that would break tendons without detonating, and pressed the trigger through like it was just another breath leaving the body. The glass belched a circle of harmless bright, the woman crumpled with her hand obedient to physics, the thumb flung wide. Jessica was already back on the man with the SMG, but he jerked the kid sideways at the pop like a puppet on the wrong string and for a sliver the muzzle crossed the trainee's ribs. She couldn't take chest, she couldn't take head, she couldn't wait. She took elbow. The joint exploded backward and the SMG became a weight attached to a stranger, and the kid bolted because that's what bodies do when permission arrives. "Switch neutralized, gun arm disabled," she said, and if her voice shook, the net didn't tell on her. In the periphery, motion at the comms mast, not electricity this time, but a man trying to raise a handset from a SAT pouch he'd been guarding with his life. She bent around through the pouch so the phone died without reporting it, and the man did that slow collapse people do when they realize their choices just ran out. Then the worst thing happened, the vest on the floor in the hall chirped twice, arming tone, maybe, or maybe just cheap electronics, but every spine on the net went to ice. "Device audio," Blake said, hustling, boot steps you could feel through the words. "Hold movement," Holbrook ordered, quiet enough to steady a surgeon. Jessica slid to the broken window and read wires like they were sentences. She couldn't see detonators, she could see a cinderblock behind the vest, the way the strap lay, the angle of the board beneath. She knew a shot to the battery could end the conversation or start a new one. The safer choice was a tech. They didn't have time to import safer. She built the hold like a bridge, 1/2 mil low, a hair of right for the air, and the kind of squeeze you use when you don't believe in luck but you'll accept its company. The battery pack popped like a toy, smoke coiling out lazy, and the tone died mid-bleat. Vest power down, she said, only then letting her ribs remember how to move. Confirm, Blake breathed, and she could hear the way the team exhaled in unison though none of them meant to. On the yard, the trainees flowed under arms and blankets again, shock monumental and ordinary in their faces. It should have been the end, but climaxes have that bad habit of thinking they deserve an encore. The wounded rider from the second sled dragged himself to a knee behind the bumper of the dead pickup and came up with something stubby and mean, a tube that didn't belong in this conversation. Grenade launcher, she clipped out, already dialing for the shorter range. He had one shot and a bad field of fire and he chose the window anyway, because desperation is a terrible coach. She met the muzzle with around half a breath before his thumb met the latch. The tube cracked off target and the round jittered into open snow where it buried itself and coughed a fountain of ice. His second hand lifted like surrender was now interesting, and this time she let the idea thrive. Launcher out. Shooter surrendering. The ridge wind shifted again, larger now, and the first real flakes began to speak a different weather. On the net, Grant finally remembered to arrive. Command, confirm neutralization and proceed to exploitation. We'll need names, materials, photos, chain of custody. Holbrook didn't bother hiding the authority in his tone. You'll get your paperwork, Major. Overwatch, status. She scanned in rings, yard, windows, tower, road, tree line, the mute sleds cooling like animals after a run, and counted not threats but absences where threats should have been. When she spoke, it felt less like declaring victory than acknowledging a moment that would not stay. All immediate threats suppressed. Hostages secure. Perimeter held. Weather degrading. The last light threw a thin gold across the snow and then let it go. She stayed on glass until the assault team's last pair cleared the far stairwell and Blake said, "Overwatch, you can breathe," in a voice that was grateful without being dramatic. Only then did she peel her cheek from the stock and realize her face had gone numb. The mountain didn't care what she'd done. It just took the heat she'd left on the rock and asked for more. Holbrook came back on comms softer than she'd ever heard him. "Jessica, that's enough for today." Maybe, she thought, but not for what comes after. She broke the position down with the same care she'd built it, packing away angles and distances and the part of herself that lives at 2,000 yards, and as she stood into the wind she understood what every peak tries to teach: peace is not a gift, it's a guard post, and you hold it until someone else can relieve you. So Jessica held it all the way down the ridge, glassing the compound while Blake's team finished the sweep and the last trainees were walked under blankets to the staging area where medics with red-cheeked faces counted pulses and names. The wind thickened into proper snow, the kind that erases tracks faster than guilt, and when Holbrook finally said, "Overwatch, collapse to exfil," she backed out of the hide the way you leave a room you might need later, nothing disturbed that didn't need to be. The helicopter came in low and honest, rotors chopping the new weather into pieces small enough to breathe, and Riley's voice crackled from the staging net. He'd stayed at Fort Ironwood on duty, listening to the mission thread like a kid listens to baseball on AM radio. "Ma'am, we heard you, nice work," and then he caught himself and said it right, "Overwatch, solid." She didn't answer because there wasn't a line item for that in any SOP, but she tucked the sound into a pocket she didn't admit to having. Back at Ironwood, the hangar lights were too bright and the heater's metallic breath made the desert smell like old coins. Grant was waiting with a folder already fat and eyes that said he'd started writing the story before the ending arrived. "We'll need a full chronology," he began, and when he said we he meant he. "Targets, angles, ammunition expenditure, decision logic, any deviations from doctrine." Blake angled himself half a step forward so the conversation had to go through him, calm as fence wire. "You'll get a complete report through command channels. Priority is medical checks and a hot wash on the tactical net. Grant's smile found no purchase. Of course. But timeliness maximizes recall fidelity. Holbrook came in from the flight line still wearing cold on his collar and set a paper cup of coffee in front of Jessica without ceremony, as if hydration were the only debate worth having. "Major," he said, pleasant like a desert morning, "you'll have your package by 0900. Right now we debrief what matters while it's still warm." The room that wasn't a room, just a corner of the hangar with 2 folding tables and a map, filled with the voices of people who had earned the right to be heard. The AAR cut clean, what the sleds told them about the spur route, where the catwalk blind left a seam, how the vest's cheap battery pack had saved lives because quality control had not. Jessica laid out her sequence in the same flat tone she used to log ammo, no swagger, no apology, cause and effect like a ledger. Grant interrupted twice to ask why she hadn't taken the first shot at the road bend and why she'd risked a battery detonation, instead of waiting for EOD. Holbrook answered once by pointing to the timeline, hostages within line of fire at T+4 seconds, and once by letting silence work until even Grant could hear how thin his question was. Ruiz drifted near the periphery, arms crossed like he had a problem with cold, not pride, and when the first wave of words ended he cleared his throat as if it were a bureaucratic necessity. "So," he said to no one and everyone, "paperwork's not the only thing you're better at." The smirk he'd worn for years didn't show. She could have cut him with a line, she didn't. "I'm precise," she said again, keeping it the way she knew it, and he nodded like he'd learned a new definition that didn't require an apology to be true. Cooper brought over a stack of forms he had filled out for people who would sign them when their hands stopped shaking. He set them down near her elbow and whispered, "I didn't trip today," and for some reason that, of all the facts, made her grin. The formal debrief that followed wore a different suit. Grant read from his list, redlined terms into boxes, requested capture assets for photo arrays, and asked for a modeling of engagement calculus that made Blake's left eyebrow almost laugh. Holbrook let it run just long enough to be legal, then called it. "This isn't a lab," he said, not unkind. It was a Wednesday with people in it. He turned to Jessica. "You're done for tonight." He said it like an order that was also respect. She should have gone home. Instead she walked the quiet perimeter once, boots tapping the same rhythm she used to count breath, and the desert air carried a taste of snow it had borrowed from the Rockies. In her apartment the lights were where she had left them and the couch wasn't pretending to be more than a couch. She washed the mountain off her hands and stared at the small mirror above the sink like it might remember a different face. It didn't. The phone buzzed once with a number that resolved to the base operator routing her to the command conference line. Holbrook, Blake, Grant, and, because of course, division. The voices were tired and crisp. The decision arrived wrapped in compliments. "Advisory role," Grant said as if he'd invented the term. "Training development, equipment evaluation, Overwatch doctrine optimization. Stateside. Minimal travel." Holbrook cut in so she didn't have to climb a hill she'd already climbed. "No forward deployments. Period. She sets limits." There was a pause, like a room of people all looked at the same ceiling for a cue. Jessica put words into the gap before someone else tried to own it. "I'm not returning to rotations. I'll teach the thing I know if I can keep the parts of me I need." She expected pushback. What came was something almost like accommodation. Grant framed it as resource stewardship. Blake sank a yes into it that sounded like common sense with boots. Holbrook said, "We'll draft it in the morning," which in his vocabulary meant it would already be drafted before dawn. She slept like the body does when the mind is too tired to negotiate, quick, deep, unmemorable, and woke to Nevada light that didn't apologize for being bright. At the range office, Riley waited with 2 coffees and a look he tried to iron into normal. "Logs," he said, handing her the clipboard, then added in a rush, and, thanks." She wrote the day's first serial numbers with the same steady hand as always and felt that thin layer of ordinary slide back over everything like a lid that still fit. Ruiz came by later and dropped a box of Ear Pro on the counter like an offering. Targets at 5 need fresh staples, he said, and then, clumsy but honest, ma'am. She didn't correct him. Cooper emailed a clean copy of her range inventory with a joke subject line he wouldn't have dared last week, precision, but make it admin. She let herself laugh at work, which was new. In the afternoon, Holbrook walked in with a single-page draft that said exactly what mattered in words plain enough to sign: advisory billet, Fort Ironwood based, authority to refuse tasks that violated the spirit of the agreement, primary duties in training and evaluation, optional Overwatch consultation by consent only. If you want it, he said. She read it once, then again, then lifted her pen and put her name where a different life used to go. On the way home she drove the long edge of the base where the fence runs out toward the mountains and the sky becomes more sky than anyone needs. She thought of Aspen Valley under fresh snow, the little community center with its bulletin board full of flyers that never got taken down, a place that remembered without prying. She could go there on weekends, teach breathing to kids who wanted to shoot straighter on paper than they spoke online, stand behind Riley when he learned to read Mirage, let Ruiz pretend he'd always known, let Cooper staple targets without tripping. The phone buzzed again, one line this time: Holbrook, division signed. She answered with the smallest word that could hold a future. Copy. Night came quick in the desert, clean-edged, uncomplicated. She set a kettle on the stove and leaned against the counter and finally let the tremble arrive, not in her hands but in the space under her ribs where you keep the names of the things you chose not to lose. Resolution wasn't fireworks, it was paperwork that protected you, a base commander who kept his promises, a team that spoke in complete sentences, and a job that let you be lethal only on purpose. Outside, somewhere past the lights, the runway hummed a lullaby of departures and returns. She finished her tea, washed the cup, and placed it upside down to dry, a small ritual that meant she believed in another morning. And when the next one came, Jessica met it like she met everything now, steady, deliberate, owning what she chose. The advisory billet settled into her days with the weight of something that fit. In the classroom at Fort Ironwood she taught breathing as math, trigger as patience, wind as a conversation you don't dominate. Riley soaked it up with the shameless attention of someone who wanted to be good for the right reasons. Cooper turned checklists into muscle memory and didn't trip once. Ruiz stood at the rear with his arms crossed and the new habit of nodding when a point landed. Blake sat in on a block and asked small questions that opened bigger answers. Holbrook wandered through, never interrupting, just watching like a commander who understood that competence wasn't a speech, it was a culture. Grant showed up for one session with a pad and the old smile and left with notes he didn't know how to monetize, because there isn't a line item for teaching people to be careful with power. On Saturdays, if the schedule allowed, she drove north toward Aspen Valley where snow clung to the shoulders of the pines and the air smelled like wood smoke. The community center was smaller than she remembered, bulletin board still crowded with flyers for pancake breakfasts 2 seasons late. She set paper targets at 25 yards and showed kids how to keep their shoulders down and their hearts quiet, and when they asked what she did in the army she told them she kept good records and taught people to listen to wind. It wasn't a lie. On base, her office stayed the same size as before, 4 gray walls and a desk that didn't pretend to be anything but a flat surface, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't a cover, it was space she'd earned. Reports crossed her inbox with requests for doctrine inputs, equipment evaluations, after-action reads on events she didn't have to attend to influence. She wrote plainly, because people's safety travels better on clear sentences than on jargon, and the replies started to look less like politics and more like practice. When she walked the range, shooters gave her the kind of room reserved for someone who'd put a body between you and a problem without narrating it first. She didn't take the room. She stood in it like anyone else who brought a skill. It couldn't last untouched. Nothing does. A month in, a training accident at a partner range 3 states away pulled her into a video call with faces she didn't know and a camera that wanted to make blame the protagonist. She listened more than she spoke, then said the thing that mattered in a tone that got past defenses, that safety isn't a line you paint and forget, it's a posture you hold even when you're tired. You don't rush reloads on slow ranges to feel fast. You don't skip debriefs because nobody bled. You don't pretend quiet means safe if you haven't counted. The call went long and ended without applause, which meant they'd heard her. At Ironwood, the range calendar thickened. Jessica stood behind Riley as he read Mirage and caught himself overholding. She didn't correct him with a sentence, she tapped the turrets once, a nudge that said find the center, not the excuse. He grinned and center punched the next round and tried not to look too proud. Ruiz brought her a stubborn rifle that he'd already sworn at privately. She stripped it and found a burr where there shouldn't have been one, a flaw you only find if you assume the tool isn't your enemy, ignorance is. Paperwork, he said, shaking his head, and the word didn't mean what it used to. Cooper redesigned the sign-out sheet so ammo usage matched reality without begging. Blake, who had seen good people get pulled thin by units that love results more than they love humans, kept watch over her calendar like a guardrail. Holbrook did the thing leaders rarely get credit for, he kept promises when no one was looking. He shielded her from the edges of requests that smelled like drift back toward rotations, and when Grant tried to attach her name to a tasker with travel the order called advisory presence and the schedule called deployment, Holbrook sent it back with 3 words, not per agreement. The lesson of the mountains followed her everywhere. Peace wasn't a trophy, it was a duty station. On a cold afternoon when the desert pretended to be January, she took a lunch break late and sat on the tailgate of a truck staring at the far hills. It hit her then with the softness of a fact you'd known and refused to say. Spectre hadn't been a myth to run from or a brand to sell, it was simply the name someone gave a set of choices she had made when other people needed her to make them. She didn't need the name anymore to do the work. She needed the boundary that kept the work from eating the rest of her life. She finished her sandwich and went back inside and wrote a 1-page memo titled plainly, What We Will Not Rush. It became a standard at Ironwood before the week was out. In the evenings she sometimes replayed the ridge in her head, not to relive it, but to audit it. She never found a shot she wished she'd taken differently, and that was its own quiet. The nightmares that had once come in hard, fragmented edits dulled into memories that behaved. They stopped recruiting her body into a fight her mind had already finished. When a trainee asked if fear ever went away, she told him the truth, it stays, and you learn to carry it without handing it the map. Grant tried a different angle later, inviting her to brief a visiting group with cameras, and she declined without apology. Skill is not content, she wrote back, and hit send. The refusal felt like a particular kind of accuracy. Holbrook didn't ask her to reconsider. Next week, he said instead, we start the long-range instructor course. Write it like you wish someone had written it for you. She did. It started with hydration and sleep, then went to wind and patience, then ethics and restraint, then the hard part, when not to shoot even if you can. On the last page she wrote a single line that wasn't doctrine at all. You are accountable for what your competence allows. She taped a copy to the inside of her locker where only she would see it and smiled at the redundancy. On a Sunday she drove back up to Aspen Valley. The community center was open for a winter market, and she bought a paper cup of coffee that tasted like kindness. A kid who'd been at her clinic ran up breathless to say he'd hit 3 bullseyes in a row and his mom said he could keep going as long as he did his homework first. Jessica told him that was the correct order. Snow started to fall in flakes that meant it, and the mountain the town leaned against looked like it had put on a clean shirt. Driving back, she realized the thing she'd been testing was true. The life she built now didn't have to be a witness protection program from her own past. It could be a place where past and present shared a key. At Ironwood's gate the guard waved her through with a familiarity that didn't feel like surveillance. Evening folded the base into its regular shapes and the runway hummed its song. She parked, walked to her apartment, set the kettle on again, and waited for the whistle. When it came, it sounded ordinary, which was the point. She poured, sat, and wrote 3 thank you notes on plain paper, one to Holbrook for the agreement he'd enforced, one to Blake for the questions that made rooms smarter, one to the range staff for doing boring things right. She left them where they'd find them in the morning. Then she turned off the light and let the dark be just dark. The lesson the story had earned wasn't complicated or cinematic. It was this: competence can save lives, but only if it's governed by consent, anchored by boundaries, and aimed at something larger than proving you can hit a hard shot. She didn't need applause or a nickname. She needed clean checklists, good teammates, a commander who kept faith, and a way to say no that stuck. Outside, the desert cooled fast and a small wind touched the door like a friend who didn't need to be invited in. Jessica closed her eyes on her own terms and slept deep, ready to wake into another morning she had chosen.